You can be standing in a room full of people who genuinely like you, laughing at the right moments, nodding along to the conversation, and still feel like you're watching the whole thing through glass. This isn't shyness. It's not social anxiety in the way most people picture it. For a lot of sharp, perceptive people, loneliness doesn't come from having no one around. It comes from being around plenty of people and still not being fully met by any of them. Today, we're breaking down why intelligence, the very thing that makes you good at almost everything else, can quietly become the reason you feel alone in a crowd.
Let's start with what this actually looks like. You're at dinner with friends, the conversation is easy, familiar, comfortable. And somewhere around the third topic change, you notice you've mentally checked out. Not because you're bored of the people, but because the conversation is skimming the surface of everything and landing on nothing. You want to go deeper, but you also know that pulling everyone into a deeper conversation right now would feel, to them, like you're making things weird. So you learn to keep things light. You save the real thoughts, the ones that actually matter to you, for later. For no one in particular. Because the last few times you brought them up, you watched people's eyes glaze over. Or worse, watch the conversation get redirected somewhere easier. Eventually, you stop testing the water. Not because you don't trust people, but because you've quietly concluded that most conversations have a ceiling, and you hit it faster than everyone else in the room. The confusing part is that you're not unhappy with your friends. You like them. You defend them, show up for them, choose them again. But there's a specific kind of hunger that doesn't get fed in most rooms. A hunger for someone to actually follow you all the way down a thought, instead of nodding along until you simplify it. And when that hunger goes unfed long enough, it starts to feel like something's wrong with you, rather than something that's simply mismatched. This is where a strange kind of loneliness sets in. Not the loneliness of being left out, but the loneliness of being included and still translating yourself down to fit. You go home from a perfectly nice evening and spend an hour writing out the thought you didn't say, the one that felt too much, too fast, too complicated for the room. And somewhere in that gap between what you think and what you say out loud, the isolation quietly builds. But this isn't arrogance, and it's not a flaw in how you relate to people. What's actually happening has a real explanation, and it has less to do with being too smart for everyone, and more to do with a specific, measurable mismatch that most people never get named for them. Researchers who study high cognitive ability have found something counterintuitive. Intelligence correlates with life satisfaction far less than people assume. And in some studies, highly intelligent people report lower satisfaction with their social lives specifically. The reason isn't that smart people are harder to love. It's that depth of processing changes what a satisfying conversation actually requires. And most everyday social interaction isn't built for that depth. Here's what's actually happening under the surface. A highly analytical mind doesn't just receive information. It immediately starts cross-referencing it, questioning it, following it into implications 3 or 4 steps ahead. In a normal conversation, most people are naturally exchanging surface-level information and emotional connection, which is genuinely valuable, but it moves at a different pace than a mind that's already 3 layers deeper into the topic. The gap isn't about worth, it's about tempo. And when tempo mismatches happen often enough, the sharper mind learns to idle in first gear, just to stay in sync with everyone else. Over time, this creates a habit psychologists sometimes call translation. You take the complex, layered version of your actual thought and compress it down into something easier to hand over, something that won't derail the conversation or make anyone feel like they need to catch up. Translation is a skill, and it's often mistaken for social ease. But every time you do it, a small, real part of your original thought gets left behind, unspoken, and it accumulates. So how does this actually show up in daily life? Here are the signs that this specific kind of loneliness might be running underneath your relationships.
1. You self-edit before you even finish a sentence. You start to explain something and catch yourself simplifying it halfway through, not because you're unsure of the idea, but because you can already predict the conversation isn't going to follow it there. Over time, this becomes so automatic, you stop noticing you're doing it at all. 2. You feel more like a good listener than a known person. You're skilled at drawing other people out, asking good questions, remembering the details of their lives. But when you try to recall the last time someone did that for you with the same depth, it's harder to find an example. Being genuinely curious about people is a strength, but if it's the only direction the curiosity flows, it quietly becomes a way of hiding.
3. Large groups drain you faster than deep one-on-ones. It's not that you dislike people in numbers, it's that group conversations naturally average out toward the lowest common denominator of depth, while a real one-on-one conversation has more room to actually go somewhere. You'll often find yourself gravitating toward the one meaningful side conversation happening at the edge of a party, rather than the main group. 4. You've gotten good at performing connection instead of feeling it. You know the right facial expressions, the right amount of laughter, the right follow-up questions. You can run this software convincingly, but afterward, there's a flat, slightly hollow feeling because the performance succeeded while the actual need underneath it went unmet.
5. Your richest conversations happen with yourself. The most honest, layered, interesting version of your thinking often shows up in your own head, in your notes, in the shower, in the version of the conversation you replay afterward and improve in your imagination. That's a strong signal that the real thinking is happening somewhere your relationships aren't currently reaching. And if several of these sounded familiar, this isn't proof that you're too much for the people around you. It's evidence of a pace mismatch that's been quietly managed through translation for so long that it started to feel like your personality instead of a coping strategy.
And it reinforces itself the same way most coping strategies do. Every time you simplify and the conversation goes smoothly, it confirms that translation is the safer move. The cost is invisible in the moment, so the habit keeps winning, even though the accumulated cost over years is exactly the isolation we started this video with.
You don't fix this by becoming less thoughtful or dumbing yourself down further, and you don't fix it by demanding everyone around you suddenly match your depth.
You don't need every relationship to hold your full depth. You need at least one. Pick a single person you already trust, and instead of automatically simplifying your next real thought around them, let it come out in its full, complicated form, and see what happens. Most people are more capable of following you than your habitual editing gives them credit for. Depth seekers rarely say, "I want to go deeper here," directly, assuming it will sound intense or unwelcome. But a simple, low-pressure line like, "Can I ask you something more real?" tends to land far better than expected, because most people are quietly craving the same thing and just waiting for permission to drop the surface-level script too. Not every relationship needs to carry the full weight of your inner world, and trying to force that onto every friendship will exhaust you and them. Instead, deliberately look for the specific spaces where depth is the norm, not the exception, whether that's one particular friend, a specific kind of conversation, or a community built around the exact interests where your mind naturally goes fastest. None of these principles ask you to shrink your thinking or perform being simpler than you are. They ask you to stop assuming depth has to be hidden by default and to start testing that assumption in small, specific places. Let's make this concrete. Picture someone at that same crowded party from the beginning of this video. Instead of staying in the main group and translating everything down all night, They notice one friend standing slightly apart, someone they've always sensed could handle more. They walk over and ask a real question, not small talk, something they've actually been thinking about. The friend pauses for a second, a little surprised, and then leans in. Not because they suddenly became a different person, but because most people are far more willing to go deep than they let on, and they were simply waiting for someone else to go first. The conversation shifts. It gets slower, more specific, more real. And for the first time that whole evening, the loneliness in the room quietly lifts. Not because the party changed, but because one conversation finally matched the pace their mind actually runs at. That night, they don't go home and spend an hour writing out the thought they didn't say. They already said it to someone who could hold it. The loneliness we open this video with isn't solved by finding more people. It's solved by finding or building a handful of spaces where translation is finally allowed to stop. If any of this felt familiar, the loneliness you've been carrying isn't proof that something is wrong with you or with the people around you. It's proof of a mismatch that's been quietly managed for a long time. And mismatches, unlike flaws, can actually be closed. Your depth was never the problem. It was just waiting for the right room. And sometimes the right room is smaller than you think. Sometimes it's just one honest conversation away. If this sounds familiar to you, share in the comments the moment you realized you were translating yourself down just to be understood. You're not alone in carrying it. This video is intended for general educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional psychological consultation or therapy. If loneliness or disconnection is significantly affecting your daily life or well-being, consider speaking with a licensed mental health professional. If today's video gave you a little more clarity about your own mind, hit like and share it with someone who also feels unseen in a crowded room. I'm Eco. Don't forget to subscribe so we can keep exploring the hidden corners of the mind together. Goodbye, and I'll see you next time.